The legend she built to bury you, Egyptian history for sleep. Welcome back to Vaulted World Secrets, and if this is your first time here, I'm really glad you found us. Thank you for spending your time here tonight. Before we begin, do you think Cleopatra deliberately weaponized the stories told about her body, or do you believe those stories were invented entirely by the men who feared what she had built? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. Now let's begin. There is a room in Alexandria that no longer exists. It stood somewhere along the eastern harbor, possibly above the waterline, possibly built into the limestone shelf that once held the royal quarter of the Ptolemaic palace complex. Scholars have placed it in different corners of that lost coastline. No one agrees on its exact position. The harbor itself has shifted over 2,000 years. The sea has moved, the ground has subsided. The stone platforms that once held the palace complex have slipped beneath the waterline of the Mediterranean in a slow geological surrender that began not long after the last Ptolemaic ruler died. Divers have found remnants of it in the shallows off the modern Alexandrian coast, carved blocks, column drums, the foundations of walls lying in the silt at depths that feel wrong for what they once held. The scale of what is down there implies the scale of what was once above it. What the ancient sources do agree on, and what makes certain historians deeply uneasy, is that the room above was described in extraordinary, almost theatrical detail by writers who had never been inside it. That is the first problem. The second problem is this. The woman who allegedly lived and bathed and entertained and conspired inside that room left behind almost no written record of herself. Cleopatra VII, last of the Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt, last of a dynasty that had endured for nearly 300 years, one of the most consequential political figures of the ancient Mediterranean world, wrote nothing that survived. Or, if she wrote anything, it was not preserved. The papyri that might have carried her hand have crumbled, or burned, or dissolved in the slow damp of buried centuries. The libraries that might have stored her correspondence were ransacked or lost to the ordinary entropy of time and conquest. What remains, what was passed down through the Latin tradition, through Roman historians writing decades and in some cases more than 100 years after her death, is a portrait so saturated with bodily myth and sensual legend that it functions less like a historical record and more like a warning. And warnings, in the ancient world, were almost always political documents. Before coming to the woman herself, it is necessary to sit with the city. Alexandria, in the 1st century BC, was one of the largest and most complex urban environments the ancient world had produced. It sat at the western edge of the Nile Delta, between Lake Mareotis to the south and the Mediterranean to the north, on a narrow spit of land that its founder had chosen with strategic precision. The harbor was engineered divided into 2 basins, the Great Harbor to the east and the Eunostos to the west, separated by a causeway called the Heptastadion that connected the mainland to the island of Pharos and its lighthouse. The lighthouse itself was among the tallest structures in the ancient world, its fire visible across enormous distances of open sea, guiding grain ships and warships and merchant vessels into port from every direction of the compass. The city smelled of salt and fish paste and warm stone and the particular dry heat that rose from the desert interior and met the Mediterranean air along the shoreline. In the royal quarter, which occupied perhaps a quarter of the city's total area along the eastern harbor, the stone was limestone and polished granite, pale in the summer glare, cool in the shadows of its colonnaded walkways. The palace complex was not a single building, but a compound of interconnected structures accumulated over generations of Ptolemaic rule, audience halls and administrative wings, and garden terraces and private apartments built and rebuilt across nearly 3 centuries of dynastic occupation. The floors in the formal rooms were polished to a high reflective finish. The walls carried painted plaster or carved relief or both. Incense burned in temple annexes attached to the main complex. The air inside the deepest interior rooms was still and cool, even in the hottest months of the Egyptian summer. insulated by the mass of stones surrounding it on all sides, carrying the faint residue of whatever had last been burned at the altars. This was the physical world Cleopatra VII inherited, a city that was also an institution, a palace that was also a government, an environment designed over generations to communicate power through its own materiality, through the weight of its stone and the scale of its spaces and the deliberateness of its accumulated luxury. She was born into it around the year 69 BC, a daughter of Ptolemy XII, into a dynasty that was ethnically Macedonian Greek but that governed Egypt by adopting its religious traditions, its ceremonial language, its temple iconography, and its theological vocabulary as tools of legitimate authority. The Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled since 323 BC, in the aftermath of Alexander the Great's death, when his general Ptolemy had claimed Egypt as his portion of the fractured Macedonian Empire. For nearly 3 centuries, the Ptolemies had maintained their grip on one of the wealthiest and most agriculturally productive regions of the ancient world. The Nile flooded on a cycle that Rome found uncanny, and Egyptians understood as divine the annual inundation depositing the black silt that made the delta soil among the most fertile land in the known world. Egypt fed the Mediterranean. It had done so for thousands of years before the first Ptolemy arrived. It would do so for centuries after the last one died. And it was this permanent, unkillable agricultural productivity, this geographic fact of grain and water, and the Nile's reliable generosity that made Egypt the object of Roman attention in a way that was ultimately impossible to deflect. By the time Cleopatra was born, the Ptolemaic grip on that wealth was loosening under Roman pressure. Rome was always moving during this period, absorbing territories, demanding tribute, installing client kings, repositioning alliances. Egypt was not yet formally a Roman province, but it existed within Rome's gravitational pull in a way that made its continued independence feel increasingly provisional. The Ptolemaic rulers had already begun appealing to Rome for military support, for political legitimacy, for the simple reassurance that Rome would not simply march in and take what it wanted by force. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, had paid enormous sums borrowed from Roman financiers at ruinous interest rates that would burden the Egyptian treasury for a generation to secure Roman recognition of his throne. He had traveled to Rome in person. He had sat in Roman senatorial anterooms and made himself, in the most explicit possible way, dependent on Roman goodwill for the continuation of his rule. It was into this environment of structural anxiety and inherited debt and the long shadow of a Rome that had not yet decided what to do with Egypt that Cleopatra was. Educated, she was trained in the Greek literary and philosophical tradition that formed the intellectual core of the Ptolemaic court. She studied mathematics and the natural sciences as the ancient world understood them. She engaged with administrative language and legal precedent and the accumulated machinery of 3 centuries of bureaucratic governance. And at some point in her formation, she began learning Egyptian, the language of the priests, the language of the temple inscriptions, the language that connected the Greek ruling dynasty to the ancient civilization it governed, but had never, in 3 centuries, fully joined. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler to do this. 300 years of rule, and not one of her predecessors had thought it necessary or worthwhile to speak directly to the people they governed in the people's own tongue. The theological and administrative apparatus of the Egyptian state had always been mediated through interpreters and scribes who stood between the ruler and the ruled, filtering meaning in both directions. Cleopatra removed that filter. She reportedly spoke 9 languages: Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, the dialects of the Parthian court, the Ethiopian tongues of the southern Nilotic regions, Hebrew, the Median language, others whose names the sources record with varying precision. Whether the full list is exactly accurate in its specifics, the pattern it describes is consistent to a ruler who understood that language was not merely communication but authority, not merely convenience but a form of claim over the territory whose name it could speak without distortion. She came to power in the year 51 BC at approximately 18 years of age. following the death of her father. She was initially co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. As was Ptolemaic custom, the dynasty frequently paired siblings in joint rule, a practice that Romans found strange and sometimes used to imply moral decadence in their written accounts. Within 3 years, factional conflict driven by advisors around her brother had driven Cleopatra from Alexandria entirely. She was in exile, somewhere along the eastern border of Egypt, near the desert that approaches the Sinai, raising an army and waiting for the moment when the balance might shift. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in the year 48 BC in pursuit of his rival Pompey, who had already been killed on the Egyptian shore before Caesar set foot in the city, what happened next is one of the most narrated events of the ancient world. Cleopatra needed to reach Caesar without her brother's faction intercepting her. According to Plutarch, writing approximately 150 years after these events, she was smuggled into the palace, wrapped inside bedding or a linen sack carried by a merchant. The story is vivid. It is cinematic. It is the kind of story that lodges in memory and refuses to leave. It is also unverifiable. Plutarch's account, written in Greek around the late 1st and early 2nd century AD, relies on sources that were themselves at least several decades removed from the events they describe. There is no contemporary Egyptian documentation of this encounter. Caesar himself wrote of his time in Alexandria in his Civil War commentaries, but the account deals almost exclusively with military logistics and breaks off at a politically convenient moment. The intimate dimension, the meeting with the queen, the famous entrance, the nature of their relationship appears nowhere in his own words, with the kind of detail the later literary tradition supplies. This is not a small omission. This is the founding silence around which the entire myth of Cleopatra was eventually constructed. The story of the linen sack, or the rolled carpet, depending on which source one consults, functions in the literary tradition not merely as an anecdote, but as an origin point for a particular way of imagining her, as a woman who deployed her own body as a political instrument. That framing her body as the primary tool of her statecraft is the central axis around which Roman historical memory organized her existence. And it is a framing she may, with considerable deliberateness, have helped to build. Because the detail of the entrance is too controlled, too visually precise, too coherent with the rest of what the record shows about how she operated, to feel entirely accidental. If it happened roughly as described, it was a staged entrance, a deliberate first impression, a piece of theater designed to create a story worth telling and repeating. There are things about Cleopatra VII that are historically documented in ways that do not depend on Roman literary tradition. She was a skilled administrator. The papyri that do survive from her reign, administrative documents, tax records, land grants, show evidence of a functioning, complex bureaucracy operating under her authority. There is a document from around 47 BC bearing what some scholars believe to be her own handwriting, a single Greek word, ginnesthoi, meaning make it happen or let it be done, written in a distinctive hand as a royal command on a tax exemption document for a Roman businessman. Whether the handwriting is definitively hers remains debated among specialists, but the document exists. It is physical. It sits in the papyrus collections of institutions in Berlin behind glass in a controlled environment designed to slow its continued deterioration. It does not describe a woman who bathed in milk and reclined on silk while history organized itself around her passivity. It describes someone running an empire, making administrative decisions at the granular level, applying her authority to the practical machinery of governance in the ordinary way that rulers who are actually governing must. The milk story, and this is where the historical record becomes genuinely strange, comes from much later. The association of Cleopatra with baths of ass's milk appears in sources that postdate her death by centuries in some cases, and, in the earlier instances, is woven into broader Roman, satirical, and moral writing that used luxury and bodily excess as shorthand for Eastern decadence and political corruption. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, mentions Poppaea Sabina, the wife of the Emperor Nero, as someone who bathed in asses' milk and traveled with a herd of 500 she-donkeys for the purpose. The connection to Cleopatra in popular imagination appears to have been a later conflation, a sliding of luxury imagery from one royal woman to another across the centuries of Roman literary tradition, each successive layer of retelling making the attribution more fixed, more certain, more vivid, and less tethered to any primary source. In strictly contemporary Egyptian or Greek documentation, there is no record of Cleopatra bathing in ass's milk. There is no record of this practice in Ptolemaic administrative texts, in temple inscriptions, in the limited personal correspondence that survives. The story arrives fully formed out of a later literary tradition that needed it for ideological purposes, and it is almost impossible to trace back to a first moment of invention. What there is instead, and this is where the unsettling quality of the record becomes most apparent, is a pattern of stories about her body that cluster around moments of political crisis, that intensify precisely at the points where her actual political power was at its greatest, and that seem almost structurally designed to replace her real actions with sensory legend, to paper over the administrative record with something more vivid and less documentary. In 48 and 47 BC, while Caesar was entangled in the Alexandrian War, a genuinely dangerous military situation in which his forces were besieged within portions of the city and the harbor was partially burning, Cleopatra was securing a political alliance with the most powerful military figure in the Roman world that would result in her restoration to the Egyptian throne and the elimination of her brother as a rival. This is what happened. This is documented in the historical record, incomplete as it is. What the literary tradition emphasizes about this same period, however, is not the political negotiation, it is the physical relationship. The seduction, the spell, the implication that what occurred in the palace between the queen and the Roman general was fundamentally a matter of bodies rather than minds, of enchantment rather than calculation. Cassius Dio, writing in Greek, in the late 2nd and early 3rd century AD, more than 200 years after Cleopatra's death, describes her as possessing an irresistible charm she deployed through her appearance and her voice. He is detailed about her methods. He describes her as calculating and physically overwhelming in a way that makes Caesar seem less like a military and political genius and more like a man helplessly undone by proximity to a woman. Read in the context of Roman political writing, this framing carries a specific ideological weight. Julius Caesar was a Roman hero in the complicated, contested, post-Civil War sense of that word. Explaining his decisions in Egypt by attributing them to bewitchment rather than strategic calculation did important work for later Roman writers. It preserved his reputation as a military mind by relocating his apparent attachment to a foreign queen from the realm of strategy into the realm of enchantment. The enchantress in this reading required no intelligence. She required only a body and the willingness to use it. The degree to which this framing erased what Cleopatra was actually doing is difficult to overstate. She was, during this same period, managing the internal politics of a dynasty under terminal pressure. She was navigating a court in which her own siblings had already attempted to have her killed or exiled. She was maintaining the ceremonial apparatus of Egyptian religious power, presenting herself in temple iconography as Isis, the Divine Mother, a theological claim that carried enormous weight with the Egyptian priestly class, and through them with the general population of Egypt, who understood their rulers' ritual obligations as directly connected to the functioning of the Nile, to the agricultural cycle, to the ordered universe that Matt described. She was overseeing the administrative machinery of a state that fed the Mediterranean world. She was conducting diplomacy with Rome at the highest possible level in real time, without the safety net of an established alliance or a treaty with defined terms, in a situation where miscalculation in either direction could mean the end of the dynasty and the absorption of Egypt into the Roman provincial system. She was doing all of this while being a woman in a world structured by Greek and Roman customs that afforded women limited formal authority, which meant that the legitimacy of her power required constant ritual reinforcement through religion, through spectacle, through the performance of divine identity at a scale and with a consistency that her predecessors had not needed to sustain because they had been men in a political culture that assigned authority to men by default. The temple at Dendera, dedicated to Hathor and adorned with Ptolemaic period carvings along its rear exterior wall, bears a relief of Cleopatra in the traditional Egyptian striding pose of a pharaoh making offerings. She wears the double crown. She is presented in the visual vocabulary of divine kingship that had been operating continuously in Egypt for 3,000 years before her birth. This image was carved in stone. It has survived 2,000 years of weather and conquest and neglect, and it remains legible today. It depicts something entirely different from the figure in the Roman literary tradition. It depicts a ruler performing the ritual obligations of the Egyptian state religion in the correct form, using the correct iconography, addressing the correct theological audience in the theological language that audience recognized. For Roman observers, however, this iconography read very differently, as strangeness, as excess, as the divine pretension that made Eastern rulers fundamentally alien to the Roman political imagination. Cleopatra knew this. She understood Roman cultural anxieties about Egypt, not from the outside, but from within the room, where those anxieties expressed themselves in real conversation and negotiation. She had met Caesar. She had lived in Rome for a period during Caesar's lifetime, staying at his villa across the Tiber, present in the city, moving through its social and political world, observing it closely from within. She would later form a prolonged political and personal alliance with Mark Antony, spending years in his company in Alexandria and on campaign, understanding his political pressures and his cultural assumptions with the intimacy that only sustained proximity produces. The question that several modern scholars have raised quietly and carefully, because it is a question that is very difficult to document, is whether Cleopatra deliberately amplified certain aspects of her persona for Roman consumption. Whether the goddess imagery, the spectacle, the stories about her physical presence and overwhelming sensory impact were curated for a specific audience that would interpret them through their own framework of fear and fascination toward the East. Whether she understood that Rome would never see her administrative competence and her linguistic skill as forms of power it needed to fear, but that it would absolutely fear the thing it could not categorize the Eastern goddess queen who bent Roman men to her purposes through means Rome associated with magic and with bodies rather than with minds, the meeting with Mark Antony at Tarsus in 41 BC is the episode most saturated with legendary detail in the ancient sources. Plutarch's description runs to multiple paragraphs of incense-heavy imagery. The gilded stern, the silver oars, the purple sails, the music from multiple instruments carried on the still river air, the serving women dressed as sea nymphs at the ropes and tillers, Cleopatra herself reclining beneath a canopy of gold tissue dressed as Aphrodite, the crowds on the riverbanks deserting Antony's tribunal to rush to the water's edge. The rumor spreading through the city that Aphrodite had come to revel with Dionysus for the good of Asia. Every element of this account is staged, deliberately, exquisitely staged, and the staging is the point. Antony had summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in what was effectively a command appearance, a demand that she explain her conduct during the recent civil war and formally submit to Roman oversight of her position. She came as a goddess. Antony was publicly associated with the cult of Dionysus. In his own self-presentation, he had cultivated this identification in his public ritual behavior in the Greek-speaking East, where Dionysus carried connotations of divine sovereignty over Asia. Arriving as Aphrodite meeting Dionysus was a statement of equivalence made in a visual and religious language that the assembled crowds of Tarsus would have read immediately. It said, "We are the same order of thing. You summoned me. I arrived as your match." For this to have worked for the crowds to have responded as Plutarch describes, for the stories to have spread through Tarsus, and from Tarsus into the broader Mediterranean world in the way that they evidently did required not just theatrical instinct, but organizational capacity of a high order. The gilded ships, the costuming, the orchestrated music, the staging of the scene, these were not improvised in the days before departure. They required sustained planning and the resources of a functioning state and a sophisticated understanding of how political image functioned in a world where reputation traveled through stories told by witnesses and amplified through the chain of retelling across cities and courts and letters and dispatches. The stories that came out of Tarsus were the stories Cleopatra apparently intended to circulate. She had manufactured them and then released them into the world. This is not the behavior of a woman whose primary political tool was her body in the passive sense that Roman writers implied. This is the behavior of someone who understood that the story told about power was itself a form of power, and who was capable of manufacturing stories at scale, in real time, with the organizational resources of a functioning state behind her. The legends of her sexual prowess, which appear in later sources in scattered references in Roman satirical poetry, in the pseudo-historical gossip that accumulates around famous figures across centuries of retelling, follow a similar pattern of temporal distance from the events they purport to describe. The specific claims appear in sources that are decades or centuries removed from her life. They are the sediment of a legendary reputation, not the record of documented behavior. But even the earliest layers of that reputation, the ones closest in time to her actual life, were shaped by Roman political necessity in ways that are traceable once the underlying political logic becomes visible. Octavian, who would become Augustus, first emperor of Rome, after his defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, had a specific political problem regarding Cleopatra that required a narrative solution. He needed to justify what was, in structural terms, a civil war fought against another Roman. Antony was Roman. Fighting Antony directly as a Roman rival risked looking like precisely the kind of naked power struggle that Roman civic culture officially condemned. The solution was to fight not Antony, but Cleopatra, to declare war formally against Egypt, against the foreign queen, and to frame Antony not as a political opponent, but as a man who had been unmanned by an Eastern enchantress, stripped of his Roman virtue and his Roman self-possession, transformed into something soft and dependent by prolonged proximity to a woman who was herself not merely foreign, but supernaturally dangerous. This framing required Cleopatra to be a specific thing in Roman public imagination. She needed to be overwhelming. She needed to be sexually dangerous in a way that made resistance to her essentially impossible for any man who came near enough. She needed to be the embodiment of the thing Rome feared about the East: excessive wealth, excessive luxury, religious strangeness, and indifference to the austerity and self-discipline that Romans, at least in their official self-mythologizing, claimed to prize as the foundation of Roman greatness. The East corrupted, the East softened, the East unmade Roman men by offering them pleasures incompatible with Roman virtue. Cleopatra, in the Augustan propaganda tradition, was the East made flesh, its promise and its threat concentrated into a single figure. There was also the matter of her son. Caesarian Ptolemy XV, the child she had borne to Julius Caesar and whom she had installed as co-ruler of Egypt, was still alive when Actium ended. He was 17 years old. He was, in blood, Caesar's only legitimate male heir. Octavian's own claim to Caesar's name and legacy rested on adoption, on a legal instrument rather than bloodline. Caesarian's existence was a standing refutation of that claim. Octavian had him killed within days of Cleopatra's death. The annexation of Egypt as imperial personal property, administered directly by the emperor rather than through a senatorial governor, sealed against Roman political access, in a way no other province was not merely about grain. It was about ensuring that the territory that had produced Caesar's only blood heir produced nothing further that could threaten the new order. She had understood this. It is one reason the propaganda required her to be remembered as a seductress rather than a stateswoman. A seductress produced a bastard. A stateswoman produced a dynasty. Octavian's propaganda machine was, by the standards of the ancient world, sophisticated and extensive. He managed the public narrative of Rome at a level that no previous leader had achieved. And in the years following Actium and Cleopatra's death in 30 BC, the shape of her legend in Roman memory was largely determined by what Octavian and his successors needed her to be. What they needed was for her story to end as a cautionary tale, a demonstration that Eastern enchantment, however powerful, could not prevail against Roman order and Roman moral seriousness. What they did not need, and what the subsequent literary tradition duly suppressed, was a Cleopatra who had governed competently for 21 years, who had maintained the structural independence of Egypt from Roman absorption longer than anyone else in the Ptolemaic line, who had administered the most agriculturally productive territory in the Mediterranean world through periods of war and drought and political crisis, who had spoken to her subjects in their own language for the first time in 3 centuries of dynastic rule, who had understood, with extraordinary precision, how mythology could be manufactured and deployed as a political instrument, and who had done it right up until the end, with a skill that the empire that defeated her immediately borrowed and repurposed for its own use. The question that hangs unanswered over all of this, and that no surviving document resolves with any certainty, is how. Much of the legend was already in existence before Actium. How much had Cleopatra built herself? Whether the image that Octavian's propaganda weaponized against her was an image she had originally constructed for different purposes in a different political context, where she controlled the terms of her own mythology, the chronology, examined carefully, suggests something genuinely unsettling. The most vivid and enduring elements of her legend, the theatrical entrance, the divine arrival at Tarsus, the overwhelming sensory presence described in the sources closest to her lifetime, are not elements that seem to originate in hostile propaganda. They seem to originate in performances she staged herself. Performances she chose to make in the full knowledge that they would be witnessed, described, and repeated. The myth was a weapon. She may have built it first. And someone else picked it up after she died and turned it on her memory. There are small things in the record that are suggestive of this double quality in her self-presentation. The way she is depicted on coinage, strong-featured, long-nosed, diademed, with an expression of formal authority that leaves no ambiguity about the status of the figure. The reports, scattered and imprecise but consistent enough to notice, that she was known primarily for her intelligence and her voice, for the quality of her conversation and her mind, rather than specifically for her physical appearance. Plutarch himself, among the most detailed of the ancient sources on her physical presence, writes that her beauty was not the kind that struck on first sight, but that the effect of spending time with her was overwhelming, that her wit and her knowledge and her manner of engaging created an impression that simply did not fade. This is a very different order of charisma from the one that later mythologizing produced. It is the charisma of an intellect, not of a body. The bathing in ass's milk survives in popular imagination. The document bearing the word Genestroi in what may be her own hand does not. The number of lovers attributed to her by hostile sources survives in the general cultural memory of her. The 9 languages do not. The theatrical arrival at Tarsus survives spectacular and impossible to forget. The 21 years of governance of a complex multi-ethnic empire conducted under conditions of extreme external pressure survives only in fragments, in tax documents and land grants, and the faint impressions of a bureaucratic signature on a form in a collection in Berlin. There is something deeply unsettling about this architecture of memory, about the precision with which one category of record survived and another faded. It is difficult to tell, across the distance of 2,000 years, whether the survival patterns are the ordinary entropy of ancient archives, the accidents of fire and flood and neglect and the simple passage of time, or whether there is something more intentional in what remains and what was allowed to disappear. The oldest surviving sources on Cleopatra are all Roman. They are all, in different ways, produced by a civilization that had absorbed Egypt by conquest, that had political reasons to frame her as a cautionary figure, and that was structured by gender norms, which made a powerful, independent female ruler a conceptual problem requiring narrative resolution. The Egyptian sources, the temple inscriptions, the priestly records, the administrative papyri survive only in fragments, and they present a figure so different from the Roman portrait that scholars have sometimes found it difficult to recognize the same person. In Egyptian temple contexts, she is a functioning divine ruler. She is Isis. She is the mother of Horus. She is presented in the same visual and theological vocabulary as every Ptolemaic ruler before her, and indeed as the pharaonic tradition stretching back thousands of years before that dynasty began. There is no milk in the temple inscriptions. There is grain and the Nile and the eternal cycle of agricultural abundance and divine order that Egyptian theology placed at the center of legitimate rule. The story of her death is contested at every level. The serpent the asp, in most popular accounts, arrives from a basket of figs, a death scene of theatrical completeness that is almost too coherent with the rest of her life to be coincidental. Plutarch, who provides this version, acknowledges in his own text that there are competing accounts and that the matter is uncertain. A study by a German historian in the early part of this century proposed a mixture of hemlock, wolfsbane, and opium as more pharmacologically consistent with the reported symptoms than the bite of a cobra, which typically produces a violent and protracted death rather than the peaceful, sleep-like end the sources describe. The asp, however, is better theater. A woman who had built her entire political life on the controlled deployment of image and symbol choosing a death by the sacred royal serpent is, as a final act, completely coherent with everything that preceded it. If she chose it, it was not weakness. It was the last performance, the final myth manufactured and released into the world on her own terms before Rome could take even that from her. Antony died first. He had returned to Alexandria after Actium believing, on false report, that Cleopatra was already dead. His suicide, the last act of a Roman general who understood that his position had become irretrievable, left her alone in a city that was now, in every practical sense, Octavian's. She attempted to negotiate terms. Octavian received her envoys and gave nothing. She understood what he intended: a Roman triumph, the living queen of Egypt, displayed in chains through the streets of Rome, the embodiment of Eastern excess made spectacle for a Roman crowd. She had spent 21 years refusing to be anyone's spectacle on anyone else's terms. She would not begin at the end. She died in August of 30 BC. She was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt in various configurations and under various pressures for approximately 21 years. She had maintained the independence of Egypt from direct Roman absorption for the entirety of her reign, an achievement that ended only with her death, after which Octavian immediately annexed Egypt as a personal possession of the emperor rather than a standard provincial territory, precisely because its agricultural wealth was too important to be entrusted to a Roman governor who might use it to build a rival power base. Egypt, the prize. Egypt, the reason. She had understood what she was in Rome's imagination better than Rome wanted her to, and she may have spent 21 years using that understanding against the very empire that was trying to absorb her, weaponizing Rome's fears and fascinations and projections into a mythology that kept her on the throne of the last independent Ptolemaic state for 2 decades, in which every structural force in the Mediterranean world was working toward her removal. The scholars who work on this period, who read the papyri in climate-controlled rooms in Berlin and London and Cairo, who examine the coins under magnification, who cross-reference the temple inscriptions at Dendera with the Latin literary tradition, have been quietly complicating the Roman portrait for the better part of a century. The work is slow and incomplete, limited by the fragmentary nature of the surviving sources, and by the degree to which the Roman tradition dominated the historical record for so long that it shaped even the questions scholars thought to ask. But in the fragments, something persists. In the administrative documents and the temple reliefs and the coins and the faint impressions of what may be her handwriting on a tax exemption form in a collection in Berlin, there is a different architecture of meaning. One that does not require the milk bath to explain her power. One that does not require the carpet or the asp or the overwhelming physical magnetism. One that simply requires a woman who was, by every available measure, extraordinarily intelligent, operating in conditions of extraordinary difficulty, with a sophisticated understanding of how power worked and how mythology could be made to serve political ends that bureaucratic records alone could never sustain. The milk never existed in contemporary record. The languages existed, the inscriptions existed, the administrative competence existed. The 21 years of sovereignty over the most powerful and most coveted territory in the ancient Mediterranean world existed. What happened to those records, and who decided which stories would survive, and whether any of the survival was by her own design? These are questions that 2,000 years of scholarship has not fully answered. They remain open in the dust of Alexandria, in the submerged limestone of the harbor, in the rooms that no longer exist above the waterline, in the silence where her own words should be. There is a particular quality to the silence that surrounds her in the documentary record that is worth dwelling on more carefully, because it is not a uniform silence. It is a shaped one. Certain kinds of information about Cleopatra VII have survived with remarkable consistency across different source traditions and different time periods. Other kinds of information have not survived at all, or survive only in the most fragmentary form, and the line between what survived and what did not maps with uncomfortable precision onto the line between what served and what threatened the Roman political narrative that emerged after Actium. The grain records from the late Ptolemaic period, for instance, are fragmentary but real. The Nile Delta's agricultural output in the decades around her reign was enormous by any ancient standard. The distribution systems, the tax infrastructure, the operational mechanisms that channeled grain from the fields to the harbor, and from the harbor to the ships, and from the ships to the cities that depended on Egyptian surplus, all of this required governance. Active, continuous, technically complex governance. The evidence that this governance was happening, that Egypt did not collapse under the weight of Roman pressure and dynastic conflict and regional war, is present in the papyri, in the land documents, in the scattered bureaucratic records that have survived well enough to be legible. But this evidence exists in a form that is inaccessible to most people who encounter her story. It requires specialized knowledge of ancient documentary papyrology, proficiency in Demotic and Greek scribal hands, access to collections scattered across institutions in multiple countries. It is not the evidence that shapes popular memory. The legend of the milk bath is accessible to anyone. It requires no specialized knowledge, no archival access, no ability to read ancient script. It travels easily, reproduces readily, and attaches to its subject with the particular adhesiveness of a story that is vivid and that answers a psychological need, the need to explain a powerful woman's power in a way that does not require acknowledging the possibility that her power was simply hers, earned through intelligence and capacity, and the accumulation of skill over time. This asymmetry between the difficult evidence that complicates the myth and the easy evidence that sustains it is part of what makes the historical situation so unsettling when examined closely. The true record requires effort to reach. The false record requires nothing. And in a culture that processes historical figures through the medium of popular imagination rather than archival research, the story that requires nothing will almost always win. There is also the question of what happened to Alexandria itself after 30 BC. Octavian Augustus did not destroy the city. It was too valuable for that. Alexandria remained the second city of the Roman world for centuries after the Ptolemaic dynasty ended, its harbor still the primary conduit for Egyptian grain into the Mediterranean trade system, its intellectual institutions still functioning, its population still enormous and diverse and economically vital. But the palace complex, the royal quarter, the administrative heart of the Ptolemaic state, underwent deliberate transformation. The spaces that had been the operational center of Cleopatra's government were repurposed. The physical environment in which she had ruled was overlaid by Roman institutional use, by the apparatus of a provincial administration that had no interest in preserving the record of what it had replaced. The library already damaged during the Alexandrian War of 48 to 47 BC did not survive intact into the Roman period. The exact nature and timing of its destruction is debated by scholars with considerable vigor, but the accumulation of losses across multiple episodes of fire and neglect and deliberate removal over the centuries following the Roman conquest meant that the documentary record of the Ptolemaic period that had been held in Alexandria's institutional archives was largely gone within a few generations of Cleopatra's death. Whatever personal correspondence she had maintained, whatever administrative records bore her hand, whatever diplomatic documents recorded the actual terms of her negotiations with Caesar and with Antony, if any of these were in Alexandria when Octavian arrived, they were not preserved. This does not require a conspiracy. It requires only the ordinary behavior of conquerors and the ordinary fragility of papyrus in a world without humidity control or archival science. But the result, whatever its cause, is a documentary vacuum at the center of her story that the Roman literary tradition moved immediately to fill with its own materials, its own frameworks, its own political needs. And the shape of that filling, the specific contours of the myth that grew in the space where her own record should have been, is not random. It is too coherent, too consistent, across multiple Latin authors writing at different times and from different perspectives, to be the product of pure chance. It has the quality of a portrait painted by people who never met the subject, but who had very clear ideas about what she needed to look like. The bodies of women in the ancient world, and specifically the bodies of powerful women, functioned in Roman literary and rhetorical tradition as a site where political anxieties could be deposited and made manageable. A woman who was powerful because of her mind, her administrative capacity, her linguistic skill, her understanding of political image, was difficult to contain within the rhetorical categories that Roman political culture used to process female power. A woman who was powerful because of her body, because she was irresistible, because she deployed physical attraction as her primary instrument, because she bewitched men rather than persuading or governing them, was much easier to categorize. She was dangerous, but her danger was legible. It had a known shape. It could be named and contained within existing moral frameworks that Roman writers had well-practiced tools for handling. The transformation of Cleopatra VII from an administrator and a political operator into a seductress and an enchantress was, in this sense, a profound act of categorical management. It took something that did not fit the available boxes and forced it into a box that already existed. The process produced a figure that Roman culture could tell a coherent story about, a story with a beginning, a middle, and a morally satisfying end, in which Roman virtue ultimately prevailed over Eastern excess. But it produced this coherence at the cost of the actual record, at the cost of everything in her story that resisted the available categories, at the cost of the genistoi and the 9 languages and the 21 years of governance and the carefully staged mythology she had built to protect herself from exactly this kind of erasure. What is perhaps most striking, when the full weight of the evidence is considered, is how much she seems to have anticipated it. The Tarsus entrance, with its deliberate theological staging, its calculated deployment of divine iconography, its orchestrated spectacle designed to generate a specific story in a specific audience. This is not the behavior of a woman who believed that her actual record would protect her. It is the behavior of someone who understood that in the Roman world, narrative was more powerful than administrative documentation, and that if she did not control her own narrative, someone else would construct one for her. She controlled it for as long as she could. She controlled it during her lifetime, deploying herself as Isis in the Egyptian religious context, and as Aphrodite in the Hellenistic theatrical context, and as a diplomatic peer in the Roman political context, shifting her self-presentation with fluency across 3 different civilizational registers simultaneously. She may have controlled the story of her own death, choosing a method and a setting that produced the image she wanted: the asp, the basket of figs, the peaceful end. The last act of a theatrical life played out with full awareness of its audience. And then she died, and the audience changed. And the narrative apparatus she had built over 21 years was inherited by people who had every reason to repurpose it and no reason to preserve the original. The milk exists in the telling because the telling needed it. The Genestoi exists in the archive because the archive does not need anything, it simply holds what survives. And what survives, fragmented and difficult and largely inaccessible, is enough to suggest that the full truth of her story was never primarily about her body. It was always, and only, about what she knew. There is one more thing worth sitting with before the story closes: the coin. Not the legend, not the literary portrait, but the physical object. Ptolemaic coins bearing what is understood to be Cleopatra VII's portrait have survived because metal survives. Papyrus does not. Stone survives unevenly. But bronze and silver, and the images struck into them, have a durability that papyrus and plaster and the accumulated administrative record of a government cannot match. The coins are small. They fit in the palm of a hand. The portrait on them is not softened or idealized. The nose is prominent. The jaw is strong. The diadem sits with authority. The expression, such as it can be read in a relief struck into metal, is one of formal power rather than seductive invitation. This is not a face designed to seduce. This is a face designed to be recognized as a ruling authority on the currency of a functioning state. Coins served a practical purpose in the ancient world beyond commerce. They were a medium of political communication, a way of circulating the image of legitimate power through every transaction, in every market, in the territory. A Ptolemaic coin bearing Cleopatra's portrait was, in every merchant's hands, and every tax collector's receipts, and every trader's money pouch, a small iteration of the same argument. This is the ruler. This is what power looks like. This image is the image of authority in this place. The portrait she chose for her coinage is consistent with the portrait that survives on the temple reliefs, not the bewitching enchantress of the Roman literary tradition, but the ruler of a state presented in the iconographic vocabulary of legitimate sovereign power. It is the self-presentation of someone who understood that her authority needed to be legible in multiple visual registers simultaneously: the divine register of the temple, the commercial register of the coin, the theatrical register of staged spectacle, each one calibrated to its audience, each one deliberate. Modern archaeological work in the Eastern Mediterranean continues to surface fragments that complicate and enrich the picture. Underwater surveys of the submerged royal quarter in the Alexandrian harbor have located architectural elements that scholars are working to map against the literary descriptions of the palace complex. The work is slow and technically demanding. The visibility in the harbor is poor, the sediment is disturbed by shipping traffic, the site is in active use as a modern port. But what has been recovered suggests a complex of considerable scale and sophistication, a physical environment consistent with the administrative center of a major Mediterranean state. The researchers who do this work are not looking for the room with the milk bath. They are looking for floors and walls and the plan of a government. They are looking for the physical record of a functioning state in the place where that state operated, hoping that the stone will tell them something the papyri cannot. In the silt of the eastern harbor of Alexandria, 2,000 years after the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty died, the search for the real record continues. What they find, when they find anything, will not be the legend. It will be something smaller, harder, more resistant to interpretation, and infinitely more valuable, the material trace of a woman who built an empire out of languages and rituals and stories, and who understood, perhaps better than anyone in the ancient world, that the most durable form of power was not the kind you exercised, but the kind you made people believe you had. The milk never existed in contemporary record. The languages existed, the inscriptions existed, the administrative competence existed. The 21 years of sovereignty over the most powerful and most coveted territory in the ancient Mediterranean world existed. What happened to those records, and who decided which stories would survive, and whether any of the survival was by her own design? These are questions that 2,000 years of scholarship has not fully answered. They remain open in the dust of Alexandria, in the submerged limestone of the harbor, in the rooms that no longer exist above the waterline, in the silence where her own words should be. If you find yourself drawn to histories like this, to the ones where the record is incomplete and the silence says more than the text, consider subscribing. There are many more that have yet to be fully understood.